So after the very schematic, formulaic, 6-day, 7-day creation story in Genesis 1, suddenly at the beginning of Genesis 2, in the middle of the 4th verse or so, find ourselves in a very different sort of world. It's a world that is somehow, everything that was created before seems to have disappeared. It's not a watery chaos anymore. It's dry and dusty, and there's no rain, and there's no human to till the soil. And then Adam is created, and the garden, and everything that goes with it. It's a famous story, very different from the other one, but just as famous. What's interesting is, as far as I know, there's no reference to this story anywhere else in the rest of the Bible.
Yeah, I think in the rest of the Hebrew Bible.
That's the one I meant.
No, yes.
What do you make of that?
It becomes fairly important later on. Mm-hmm. Actually, it begins to be important in the 2nd century BC. In the book of Ben Sira and then in the Dead Sea Scrolls, the sin of Adam looms large. But actually, in the Hebrew Bible, it doesn't seem to, it's not the story you look back to explain everything that's going on after this. Mm-hmm. Now, what we make of this, I don't know. I mean, some people would suggest that it must have been written quite late. Right. I think, I would go some of the way with that. Not as late as some people would want to make it. But it surely was hardly written back in the time of King Solomon, as people used to believe when the Yahwist was dated very early.
Right. It's worth pointing out, I should say, that there are lots of episodes, especially at the beginning of Genesis, that never make another appearance anywhere else.
Yeah. Well, I think that would the same would hold, you see, for the whole primeval history, probably. Mm-hmm. Exactly. But now, here, as with a lot of the primeval history, there are a lot of parallels with Babylonian myths. Mm-hmm. And especially the story of Atrahasis, because in Atrahasis, you have the movement from the creation of humanity up to the flood. And we'll come back to that, I dare say, when we get to the flood.
I'm sure we will.
And there are overtones here of Gilgamesh. Mm-hmm. In a way, it's a coming-of-age story. It's how people get to be human in the sense that we understand humanity.
At the same time, I tend to think that there's something at least more native Israelite to this story than there is to the story in Genesis 1, which has such close parallels to the Enuma Elish. There's something about the watery chaos of Genesis 1 that doesn't sound like something an Israelite would ever come up with. But a dry, dusty earth where there's no rain and you need someone to work the ground to make it viable. That's the Israelite existence in a nutshell. That issue of the dust, right, plays in very strongly in this story. It's not only what the earth is like beforehand, this is the composition of mankind in this story.
And humanity is constituted by dust and breath. Now, in some of the Babylonian stories, it's clay, and you make little statues and then blow into them. But it's a very simple kind of anthropology.
Yeah.
And the whole purpose for which the man is created at the beginning of this is to till the garden.
That's right.
This is the model of the royal garden, typical in the ancient Near East, and you need somebody to look after it.
That's right.
God isn't good to do that himself. And of course, in some of the Babylonian stories, you have a whole class of gods who could do this. But then in the middle of this garden, we have, how many trees was it? In the middle of the garden here?
It's 2 trees.
Yes.
Although there have been people who have suggested that it was originally only 1 and then another one was added later. But the story is fairly clear that there are 2 trees. What's unclear, or at least unstated, is you can really only eat from one of them before God will get angry. There's the tree of life, theoretically of immortality, and there's a tree of knowledge of good and evil.
Isn't there a certain lack of symmetry in that? If you're going to call one tree the tree of life, wouldn't you think the other one should be the tree of death? And in fact, then what does he say will happen to you if you eat from the other tree?
God says, on that day, you will surely die.
You will surely die, yes.
The serpent sees through that fairly quickly, though.
But it is, there is, what should we say, less than clear labeling.
I think that's true.
It would have been more direct, at least, to put a sign on the second one and say, tree of death.
Right.
But of course, nobody does anything, nobody would eat from it.
Right. So there is an interesting question with the tree of life, the mechanism of which we don't quite understand. That is, do they eat the tree of life regularly and it continues, right? As long as they keep eating from it, they are immortal? In which case, it's true. Once they eat from the tree of knowledge, they are banished from the garden, which means they lack access to the tree of life now, and they are destined to die. Or is it the tree of life, they eat it once and they are immortal? In which case, we have to assume that they never ate it before God said not to.
Yes, and I think that's not clear really in the story, but we do know that at the end, at the time when they're expelled from the garden, they now can no longer eat from the tree of life. That option is off the table.
As is immortality.
And as is immortality. And the question is, were people meant to be immortal? It's often assumed that they were.
Yeah, I mean, when you read the story without knowing how it's going to end,
Yeah.
the opening of man's history is there's one guy in a garden. There's no sense that he's ever going to die. He's plopped down there to tend the garden. In theory, were he happy doing that for the rest of all time, that's where he would still be.
Yeah.
God creates animals because he has a sense that Adam is lonely. But it has nothing to do with mortality. It has nothing to do with procreation. And Eve, the woman that's created at the end, is simply the last of the animals that God creates in the hopes that Adam will find someone to keep him company.
Oh no, this is a delightful way of putting it, and I'm sure you'll get some feedback on it. Woman is the last of the animals. Now, what is her relationship here to Adam? She's taken out of his rib, and she's told that she's described as a helpmate for him.
Yes.
Is this created equal?
There is an element of it, I think. She is of the same substance as Adam.
She's certainly more like him.
She's certainly more like him, and I think that she's
he does let the animals over.
She is expected, I think, to help him. That's the help part. I think she's expected to help him in his tending of the garden. What that help constitutes is unclear. But she is, he says, bone of my bone and flesh of my flesh. She is different in kind. But she is when is she created? She's created because none of the animals were suitable. Right? They weren't suitable helpmates, if you will.
And depending what he was going to do in the garden, you think a horse might have been fine, but it's certainly not as subordinationist as some people have tried to make it be, and it's not necessarily equality of roles either.
Right.
So it's a secondary role, but still essentially the same kind. But now, trouble is going to start here, because what goes wrong in the garden?
Mostly what goes wrong is the snake tells the truth.
Yeah.
The snake.
You could even push that back a little bit. I said that what goes wrong is if you have one tree, you've a lot of trees in the garden, and you tell people you can eat from anything except that one. Try this with your kids at home. What are they going to do? It's almost a setup.
Right. In some ways, the story is really the invention of reverse psychology.
Yeah.
But
so the snake tells the truth.
The snake tells the truth. That in fact you will not die from eating it.
Yeah.
They will die eventually, but not on that day. Right. The snake says, "Did God really say that?"
Yeah.
Right. But if you eat from it, your eyes will be open.
Who is the snake anyway? Even just last week in class, I was teaching some later materials talking about the invention of Satan in some of the later apocalyptic literature, and an African student came up to me and said, "But doesn't Satan go into the snake in the book of Genesis?"
No. Satan goes into the snake much later than the book of Genesis.
Actually, around the turn of the era, I would say the first instance of it is in the book called The Wisdom of Solomon. You definitely have it in the book of Revelation. But here, he's not the devil.
No.
What is he?
The question is he an independent-minded sort of character? Or is he doing a necessary, certainly on the narrative front, he's doing necessary work. Right? Because in order for us to be around, in order for the author to be around to have written the story, someone had to get Adam and Eve out of the garden.
Yeah.
In part because Adam and Eve, in theory, would be living forever in the garden. And I don't think that they would be having any children, because I don't think there's any indication.
Any need. Yeah.
There's no need for it.
But let's get on here to what then the Lord says after he discovers that they have eaten the fruit.
Right.
And it takes him a little while to figure out what has happened even. And we'll skip right to what he says to the woman. I will, now this again is the NRSV, I will greatly increase your pangs in childbearing. In pain you shall bring forth children, yet your desire shall be for your husband, and he shall rule over you.
Right. If you want a verse that has been used for the subjugation of women, there it is. I think this is one of the most abused verses out there.
Yeah.
You know, I don't love the translation, in part because it's not perfectly accurate, right? The Hebrew says, right, not you will have pangs in childbirth, but you will have labor, work. It's the same word that's used for Adam's work that he has to do.
Yeah.
His physical labors. You will have physical labors, and you will have childbirth. And we have to remember that in the context of this story specifically, right, this is a couple who has no need for children, who probably has not a lot of room in the garden to propagate, at least in the infinite way that we have now done so. The curse, such as it is on Eve, is equivalent to Adam's. Adam is told, no longer will you be able to simply live in the garden and pick fruit. Now, once you are evicted from the garden, you will have to actually physically labor in order to survive. You will have to grow food from the ground on your own.
And in any case, what we've going on in all of these, to the beginning with the snake, is explaining what they saw as the case.
That's right.
In the case of the snake, I gather it wasn't even accurate that snakes don't actually eat dust, but people thought they did. Mm-hmm. And so you're trying to explain, how did life get to be nasty, brutish, and short?
That's right.
And this is a story to do it. Now, is it a result of sin? Is that a fair thing to say? The word sin isn't actually used,
right,
and the word fall isn't actually used. But at the same time, it seems fairly clear that their condition deteriorates significantly because of disobedience, because of not doing what they were told.
This is true. But it's the kind of disobedience. I mean, what's the analogy? The best analogy is the child who has to leave the parents' house.
Yeah.
Right? They've been cared for and tended, and eventually you gotta go. And there's usually disobedience involved at some stage of childhood. But in many ways, this is a necessary step.
Yeah. Let me say two things on that, though. One is that if you look at the Epic of Gilgamesh, where also you have, you know, how it comes about that people die, but there is no moral, no morality superimposed on it. Mm-hmm. It's just something that happens. Now here there is, I think, an element of guilt, at least, that is ascribed here to what Adam and Eve do. Mm-hmm. On the other hand, it's nowhere near what would later be called original sin. In the classic Christian doctrine, you have the idea that sin is transmitted. There's no hint of that here.
Right.
That if anything is transmitted here, it's just the condition. That people aren't born into a nice garden anymore, and immortality is off the table.
At the same time, what is also transmitted is the knowledge,
and this,
right, which is an unmitigated good. It's hard to say otherwise.
Whereas, you know, when Enkidu in the story of Gilgamesh has to put on clothes, they say he became human. Mm-hmm. And that's actually what happens here with Adam and Eve.
Exactly right.
But it gets a very bad rap later on. Of course, part of what we do with the story of Adam and Eve is point out how it doesn't actually say most of the things people think it says.
An almost universal truth about the Bible. After Adam and Eve, there's a bunch of genealogy, but this what comes next in the story is one of the most famous, the flood, which we are going to come to in short order.
In short order, indeed.